trauma awareness for yoga teachers. So this is some trauma basics, some trauma education for yoga teachers. This is a very popular field at the moment. I should say where I'm coming from. So my own background is psychology, academically. I'm not a therapist, so I'm not going to teach you to be a therapist or claim I'm a therapist. My main mentor works with abused children as his primary area of concern. I have taught trauma awareness myself in a number of war zones. I spent a number of years living in war zones and teaching NGOs. So I've taught, for example, like War Child, Save the Children, Oxfam, a whole bunch of famous NGOs, before they go to these difficult places, and sometimes in the field, places like Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, Israel, Palestine, East Africa, West Africa, Ukraine. If I've taught soldiers, I've taught police, I've taught all sorts of people. Okay, so why do yoga teachers need to know about trauma? Well, trauma has a strong impact on several things. One is the body, so pretty key to yoga. Another would be relationship to authority, for example, boundaries, for example. These kind of things, pretty critical to yoga. The simple answer of why a yoga teacher needs to know about trauma is you will hurt people if you don't. Okay, so while you don't need to be a therapist, in fact, I'd highly recommend not trying to do therapy without a license. Certainly some awareness of these fields is helpful. There's lots of good information out there. Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine, Babette Rothschild. There's books on yoga and trauma now, which are very good. So this is a bit of information. Hopefully it'll be useful for my students and anyone else who's out there. I'm certainly not the world authority on this, but just knowing the basics is really helpful. Okay, so trauma is some experience of overwhelm. It's not traumatic if it's like, oh, I just don't like that, or, you know, this word is used very freely, so I define it a bit more vigorously and say, yeah, trauma is more than just not liking something. It's where there's a feeling of overwhelm, for example, can be triggered by abuse, a car accident, attack, sexual assault. There's lots of triggers for this. And, you know, in the UK, 80% of people will have some potentially traumatic stimulus in their life, so it's pretty common. Generally, though, people bounce back. They have an acute trauma response and then bounce back. Natural resilience, that's called. Good to know about that, so you don't think that every bad thing will lead you to have lifetime trauma response. However, some people can develop disorders over time. You've probably heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, maybe general anxiety disorder, or the complex trauma, you know, from lots of little things over time. So this is where the fight-flight response, which gets triggered, gets more stuck in the system over time. So if you think of a stress response, fight-flight, could be freeze as well, could be fold, flop after a while. Basic animalistic, mammalian responses. One way of looking at trauma, and it's only one way, it's not entirely accurate, but it's good for beginners, is that these responses get stuck, you get locked in. So for example, hyperarousal, quite good if you're in a war zone. When you come back from a war zone, trust me on this, not so good to be anxious and looking out the whole time, yeah? So things you can watch out for as a yoga teacher would be, for example, hyperarousal, people that can't slow down, very common. Hyperalertness, people that are constantly looking around the class. What else? Numbing, big trauma symptom, so people that can't feel their body. So I've heard yoga teachers say, feel your body, you know, follow your body, and just numb, tense people. I see this a lot in Russia, where I am now, for example. You know, just can't do that. So being aware that not everyone can feel their body so easily, and it might not be a happy place to go to. The body might not be the sort of nice paradise home that sometimes yogis think of it as. Other things with trauma, so black and white, right, wrong, you see that a lot in yoga, don't you? This is the right way, the wrong way, type of thinking. And in terms of relationships, it could be overly trusting, like under-boundaried. Definitely see that in yoga student relationships. Also, the over-boundary would be like defensive, you know, you touch them on the shoulder and they freak out. So noticing if that happens, you might want to be careful with people. One of my big things in yoga I don't like is people adjusting without permission. This happened to me yesterday in a class in Russia. I was visiting a class. I was like, get off. And the teacher was surprised that I said to her politely, I said, please ask before you touch me, which is the norm in society, right? We have power over our own body to consent. The message a yoga teacher gives people by adjusting them without asking, even if it's a non-verbal ask, is that they don't have power over their own body. This is the guru model. So you're reinforcing a message, their body is not theirs, that their body is, the authority figure has rights over that body. Is that really the message you want to give students, right? The implicit message. Most people that have had abuse need to be able to actually have their body respected, their boundaries respected. So that's really important in sort of an approach that takes this into mind, that we're not just grabbing people, there's some sense of it. Yes, other things you might see in that hyperreactivity, like I don't like yoga teachers standing behind me. That's quite bad if you've had a trauma background. What else? Sometimes being too quick can kind of trigger that hyperarousal kind of sensations there. Certain positions, I had someone, I was in downwards dog. Now someone came and adjusted me from behind. It's like, okay, had I been a survivor of anal rape, which is a lot of men who go to prison, for example, that is not going to be a nice position to be in. Yeah, there's going to be triggering there. It could be positions where, for example, I teach when the legs are wide open. I make sure, as a male teacher particularly, I'm standing back. I'm not walking around between people's legs. Yeah. How the class people are positioned, whether they're looking at each other. Sometimes it's nicer to have people in a way where they don't feel looked at, for example, so there's not that hyper-consciousness. I think you can go too far with this. I think we don't need to, unless we're working with populations that we know are definitely traumatized, it's like you can go a bit far with some of this stuff, but certainly like respect for consent, respect for boundaries, looking at how you do positions. Oh, here's another one. So you think of the traumatized person as having their sense of safety overridden or belonging overridden, then anything you can do to help those things is useful. So common one I use in Russia a lot, I tell people what's happening in the class, make sure people know they have choice, again, agency, but also say, look, here's the plan, we're gonna have lunch at 2, we'll take about an hour for lunch, if you need the toilets are over there. So you help people feel safe by making the world predictable. Yeah, unpredictability might be fun for some people, for many traumatized people, it's not so fun. Yeah, so a sense of safety, traumatized culture like Russia, particularly helpful to say this is what's going to happen. Yeah, the whole culture's traumatized, not just individuals. But you just don't know. The statistics are pretty high, so I always say better to stay on the side of caution as a teacher. I don't know if someone has had a sexual abuse background, and they're probably not going to tell me if they just met me as a yoga teacher, right? So yes, there's indicators like if you touch them on the shoulder and they either don't move, passive, or they're really moving, that's an indicator, but you don't really know, and many people have got good at sort of hiding their trauma. There's even something called repetition compulsion, where people feel compelled to go to the scene of the crime, to metaphorically, to repeat trauma, and sometimes you see that in yoga and yoga student-teacher relationships. And obviously there's more extreme symptoms, things like flashbacks or inability to concentrate, so it might not be a full flashback, but I remember when I was in the slums of Brazil and it was pretty heavy, and I came back and I found it hard to concentrate because I just kept thinking about things that I'd seen. So that wasn't so good to concentrate when I was in a yoga class at that point. So if you have people that find it struggle to concentrate or may struggle to be still in Shavasana, for example, be aware of that. There's the prison yoga project, some really good stuff on this. They talk about not using certain words, like child's pose might be difficult for people who've lost children, or corpse pose might be a bit difficult for a lot. Again, maybe we can go too far with this stuff, but in certain environments, it's well worth taking into advice. Big one, deal with your own trauma. So I have been through several forms of trauma therapy for my own trauma that I've had in my life. It's enabled me to be empathic with people, without being in my own level of hyperarousal or bad boundaries. I recommend therapeutic supervision to any yoga teacher who is working not just fitness, but more transformatively, more emotionally. I was talking to my therapist 2 days ago. It's therapeutic supervision, I'd say, is super helpful. Being outside of that guru model where you have accountability, where you're signed up for a code of ethics, I think that kind of thing is very, very helpful in order to create, safe boundaries. Other things on safe boundaries, start and end on time. It's so simple, but in terms of establishing boundaries with a group, I know loads of yoga teachers who are late or go over, like that sense of clear boundaries, having a space where it's clearly boundaried, super, super helpful as well. Okay, so a bit rambly. I hope some of those help. I know we're on time now here, so I need to go, but I hope there's at least the beginnings of people. Key thing here is to be aware of potential trauma symptoms. You can look up some of my other videos on trauma symptoms, for example. Not to overstep the boundaries of giving therapeutic advice or anything like that. Knowing when to refer is a big one. So have the name of a good trauma therapist on your phone. If someone gets triggered in a class, you're doing say a pigeon hip opener and someone bursts into tears and a traumatic memory is released from the body, which can happen. I've seen that several times. Then, you talk to them, you can be empathic, you can be listening to them, but you refer on to a trauma therapist, like get the number of one on your phone, I would say. The body can release these kind of tensions, and when people relax, they sometimes start feeling. So that can happen in a yoga class. So the key thing there is to be non-judgmental, empathic, and to refer rather than be like, okay, I can handle this because I did 200-hour teacher training. So there's some basics. There's loads more that can be said. There's loads of good resources on this, but I hope this helps as a starter. So I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, you can subscribe to the channel, hit the bell. More importantly, however, get the newsletter. So the newsletter you do, is that right? In the box here? Okay. So why you would want the newsletter? So you hear about the best videos, so you actually ask me questions, you can reply to the newsletter, I'll reply. You can hear about events, teacher trainings, other things that are happening, and stay in touch more reliably. So newsletter there.